If Richard the Lionheart lived today, he might have made history not just for the Crusades, but for being the most famous queer king in Europe. His legend, etched in stained glass and echoed in battlefield songs, has long focused on banners, blood, and holy war. But what if one of the most enduring secrets of his life was not forged in steel, but in silence? Before Jerusalem, before the papal blessings and the shattered gates of Acre, there was Paris. In 1187, Richard, then Prince of England and Duke of Aquitaine, stood beside Philip II, King of France. They were not enemies. They were not even rivals. That winter, the two most powerful men in Europe shared more than a political vision. They shared a bed. Chroniclers recorded it, though not without discomfort. They dined from the same plate, they slept under the same canopy, and they did so not once, but repeatedly. In medieval diplomacy, shared beds were symbols of trust. But this went beyond ritual. Months passed, and the arrangement continued. Nobles grew uneasy. Whispers spread. Richard's father, King Henry II, accused Philip of bewitching his son. But whether it was love, strategy, or something in between, the alliance held. It would become one of the most intimate, scrutinized political unions of the era, and perhaps something deeper, something unspeakable at the time. Richard, already a legend in his own lifetime, had crossed an invisible line. Not in combat, but in the soft candlelit spaces that history often skips. And from that point forward, the shape of power in Europe subtly shifted. Underneath a veil of loyalty, scandal, and quiet defiance. Rome, 1195. Inside the Vatican, beneath stone saints and flickering candlelight, a cloaked man knelt in silence. The marble beneath his knees was cold. The shadows leaned in as if listening. He was no monk. He was a king. Richard the Lionheart, hammer of the Saracens, icon of Christian knighthood, had come not to seek blessing, but to confess. "I have committed carnal sins," he whispered. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The weight of those words, spoken in the Pope's private chamber, was enough. Not sins of war or ambition, sins of the flesh, the kind the Church could forgive, but never name. Outside, bells rang across Vatican rooftops. Inside, the silence deepened. What had he done? Some speculated he had lain with a woman during the crusade, perhaps a servant in the shadows of Acre. But others whispered what no scroll dared write, that his sins weren't with a woman at all, that his desire had a different face, a crown, a name, Philip. He had survived a fever after the Third Crusade that nearly claimed his life. Some believed he confessed then only because death had come too close. Others believed the guilt was older, rooted in a truth no battlefield victory could erase. The Church heard his confession, but it left the record blank. No details, no condemnation, just silence. And in that silence, history began to echo. Soon after, Richard returned to France. He stood once again beside Philip. Their alliance revived. Their bond, once questioned, remained intact. Whatever had happened in that bed, or that confessional, neither king would speak of it again. But the question had been planted, and it has never stopped growing. In 1191, under the searing sun of Cyprus, Richard the Lionheart married Berengaria of Navarre. There was silk, ceremony, and strategy, but no love. She wore white, he wore armor. They exchanged vows, then parted ways. Even on their wedding night, they slept apart. To the world, it was a royal union. To those closest to the throne, it was a calculation. There would be no child, no heir, no stories of palace joy or newborn princes. Berengaria would spend most of her life waiting. Alone, sidelined, ignored. Richard never returned to her, chroniclers noticed. They asked careful questions. Was he sterile? Was it politics, or was it something the church refused to name? There were no mistresses, no acknowledged bastards, not even the faintest rumor of a secret child tucked away in some countryside estate. For a medieval king, this was not just unusual, it was dangerous. The Plantagenet dynasty depended on blood. Richard's younger brother John watched from the shadows. Ambitious, impatient, a future king waiting for a crown that Richard seemed in no rush to secure. Some historians say Richard was simply too devoted to war, that the battlefield was his true bride. But others see something more private, that he married out of duty, that he ruled because he must. But when it came to desire, his heart belonged elsewhere. In the quiet spaces between battles and ceremonies, the question lingers. Did he avoid love, or was he protecting it? And in this silence, his mother understood what the world never dared say aloud. History often remembers kings by the wars they fought, the lands they claimed, the heirs they left behind. But Richard left no child, only contradictions. And behind him stood a woman who understood them better than anyone, Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was no ordinary queen. She had ruled 2 kingdoms, led armies, survived imprisonment, and outlived nearly every man who tried to control her. She knew power, she knew politics, and she knew her son. When whispers came from Paris of Richard's closeness with Philip, of shared beds and letters warmer than treaties, Eleanor said nothing, not because she didn't care, but because she understood. She had seen it before. She had lived it. Years earlier, she herself had been followed by scandal during the Second Crusade, accused of growing too close to her own uncle in Antioch. She knew what it meant to be watched, judged, and misunderstood. She knew what it cost to live outside the lines. And so, when her son needed a bride, Eleanor arranged the match to Berengaria. She chose the silk, wrote the dowry, prepared the feast. But she did not expect the marriage to matter. What mattered was protecting her son's crown, and perhaps his heart. But protection has limits. After Richard's death in 1199, killed not in glorious battle, but by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege, what remained of his story was left to those who wrote the records. And that's where the sword went to work. The earliest chroniclers wrote it plainly. Richard and Philip shared a bed. Roger of Hoveden, writing in Richard's own lifetime, noted how they dined together daily, shared meals from the same plate, and were inseparable at night. Another monk, Ralph of Diceto, wrote of a bond between them that astonished even seasoned courtiers. But as centuries passed, the legend was polished. Victorian historians, guardians of empire and morality, edited the uncomfortable parts. The word bedfellow became a dash. Later editions erased entire sentences. Scraps of truth disappeared, replaced by elegant gaps. The myth grew cleaner, the man less complicated. Even physical manuscripts bear scars. In the British Library, one copy of a medieval chronicle shows clear signs of redaction. Under angled light, a reader can see where a knife scraped out words once inked by a monk's careful hand. What those words said exactly is lost, but the damage itself speaks volumes. The silencing of Richard wasn't unique. Across classical and medieval history, intimacy between men was often revised, erased, or redefined. Alexander the Great's kisses became political rituals. Abraham Lincoln's nights with Joshua Speed were chalked up to cramped housing. Every generation repackaged intimacy to suit its comfort. But what do we lose in doing so? We lose Philip's jealousy when their alliance soured. We lose Berengaria's quiet heartbreak, watching the husband she barely knew slip away. We lose Eleanor's fierce, silent protection, the way she guarded a truth the church would never bless. We lose Richard's solitude in the Holy Land, writing to a man who once shared his bed and perhaps his heart. We don't just lose gossip, we lose the humanity beneath the crown. And still the silence isn't perfect. It hums, it echoes. In theatre productions and films, in lectures and forums, modern scholars and artists have begun to restore what the blade once cut away. They don't claim certainty, they claim the right to ask, what if? What if one of history's greatest kings also carried a truth too dangerous to name? That question, long buried beneath armor and legend, is no longer afraid to rise. Richard the Lionheart died in 1999, not on a battlefield drenched in glory, but outside a minor fortress in France, felled by a crossbow bolt during a routine siege. No epic final charge, no heroic last words, just a fading breath, a vacant crown, and a question history never stopped asking. He left no son, no heir, no acknowledged love, only fragments, a marriage unconsummated, a mother who guarded more than royal secrets, a French king who never gave a eulogy, but withdrew quietly after Richard's death. The chroniclers remembered his victories, the sword raised high at Acre, the Saracens pushed back, the lion roaring for Christendom. But between those lines, between conquest and coronation, something tender and forbidden flickered. A shared bed, a whispered confession, a silence sharpened into myth. For centuries, that silence held, but silence, like parchment, cracks under light. In 1935, Hollywood gave us a Richard made of marble and righteousness. He stormed across the silver screen in shining armor, chaste, noble, uncomplicated. In 1968, The Lion in Winter hinted at something more, a son wounded by politics, perhaps also by longing. In recent decades, new voices, on stage, in film, in classrooms, have dared to ask, what if the rumors were true? What if masculinity wasn't bruised by tenderness, but deepened by it? What if a king could love another man and still lead armies, command empires, kneel before God? And what if history didn't need to erase that kind of king, but honor him? Picture it, a world where no scribe scraped away ink, where, and at night their beds did not divide them, stayed in the record, unchallenged, uncut. Where schoolchildren read of Richard not just as warrior, but as a man brave enough to carry a secret through war, through politics, through death. Would that change how we define strength? Would we finally understand that greatness has always come in many forms, some wrapped in velvet, not just armor? History has always been rewritten, not just by victors, but by censors. In that process, we've lost more than facts. We've lost possibilities. We lost the flicker in Richard's eyes when Philip entered the court. We lost the half-finished letters, the silence between Eleanor's careful words, the grief that never made it into the eulogies. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist. Sometimes the most radical act isn't to discover new history, but to remember what was nearly forgotten. So let the bed remain, not as scandal, but as testament. Let it remind us that not all kings leave heirs, and not all love survives parchment. Some loves shape legends in silence, some truths live in shadows until we dare to turn on the light. Richard was a crusader, a king, a conqueror, and maybe something more. Maybe the lion's heart beat for a kind of love the world wasn't ready for. And maybe that love deserves to be remembered too,